There are moments in life when time seems to stop. When a single action shatters everything you thought you knew about people, about justice, about the world itself. This is the story of one of those moments. On a warm Saturday evening in June, inside a mansion worth $47 million, surrounded by some of the most powerful people in America, a driver named Samuel Carter walked across a marble floor, looked his billionaire boss directly in the eyes, and slapped him so hard the sound echoed through 3 rooms. But this wasn't about disrespect. This wasn't about anger. This was about something buried so deep, hidden so carefully, that it took 30 years, 7 months, and 12 days to finally surface. And when it did, it destroyed everything. Because that slap, that single moment of violence in a room full of champagne and diamonds, was the end of a plan that began with a rainy night, a dead woman, and a lie that became an empire. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe, and let's prove her wrong. Let me ask you something. If you worked for someone for 7 years, drove them to business meetings, picked up their dry cleaning, waited outside restaurants while they dined with people who made more in an hour than you'd see in a lifetime, would you stay silent if you knew they'd killed someone you loved? Would you smile every morning, open their car door, say good morning, sir, and wait for the right moment? Or would the rage consume you so completely that you'd break long before you got your chance? Because that's what makes this story so haunting. Samuel Carter didn't break. He didn't crack. He waited. And he planned. And on the night of Richard Hale's 65th birthday party, surrounded by senators, tech CEOs, Hollywood producers, and family members who had no idea what was coming, Samuel finally made his move. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. After the slap, after the gasps and the screams, and the moment when security rushed forward to grab Samuel, Richard Hale didn't press charges. He didn't yell. He didn't even seem surprised. He looked at Samuel, and with blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, he whispered 6 words that made everyone in that room freeze. 6 words that would later be played in courtrooms, analyzed by journalists, and debated by millions of people online. 6 words that confirmed what Samuel had suspected all along. Hit that subscribe button. Let's prove my mom wrong today. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Richard Hale was. Or at least, who everyone thought he was. Richard Hale wasn't born rich. He grew up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. By the time he was 30, he'd built a logistics company from nothing, turning a single delivery truck into a nationwide operation that employed over 15,000 people. By 40, he was a billionaire. By 50, he was a household name. Richard Hale gave millions to charity. He funded scholarships for underprivileged kids. He built housing for veterans. He appeared on magazine covers with headlines like America's Most Generous CEO and the Billionaire with a Heart. People loved him. Politicians praised him. Business schools studied him. And if you asked anyone who worked for him, they'd tell you the same thing. Richard Hale remembered your name. He asked about your family. He sent flowers when your mother died and bonuses when your kid graduated college. He wasn't just a boss. He was a mentor, a father figure. someone who made you feel seen. But here's the thing about people who are that good at making you feel seen. They're also very, very good at making sure you don't see them. Because while Richard Hale was building his empire, while he was shaking hands and cutting ribbons and giving speeches about hard work and integrity, there was something else happening. Something buried under decades of success and smiles and carefully crafted public images. Something that began on a rainy night in October, 30 years before that birthday party. And it started with a woman named Claire. Samuel Carter was 52 years old when he slapped Richard Hale. He'd worked as Hale's personal driver for 7 years, which meant he'd driven over 100,000 miles, waited outside countless buildings, and heard fragments of conversations through the partition between the front seat and the back. Samuel was good at his job. He was always early, never complained, kept the car spotless, and knew when to speak and when to stay silent. The other staff liked him. He was polite, quiet, the kind of man who'd hold the door for you and ask how your weekend was without ever talking about his own life. And that's because Samuel didn't have much of a life to talk about. His wife had died years ago. He had no children. He lived alone in a small apartment 40 minutes from the Hale estate. And on his days off, he'd sit by the window and stare at nothing for hours. People assumed he was lonely, sad, stuck in grief. And they weren't wrong. But what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Samuel's grief had a name. It had a face. It had a specific date and time and location. And it had a person responsible. Samuel's wife, Claire, had died 30 years ago in a hit-and-run accident. She was 28 years old. She was walking home from her shift at a diner when a car struck her and left her bleeding on the side of the road. The driver never stopped. The police investigated for 6 weeks and then closed the case due to lack of evidence. Samuel was 22 at the time. They'd been married for 3 years, and when Claire died, something inside Samuel died with her. But not everything, because buried beneath the grief, beneath the numbness and the sleepless nights and the years of wondering why, there was a tiny, flickering ember of suspicion. A suspicion that became a theory that became an obsession, and eventually an obsession that became a plan. The party was supposed to be perfect. Richard Hale's 65th birthday was a milestone, and his family had spared no expense. The mansion was decorated with white roses and gold accents. A live band played jazz near the infinity pool. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than most people spend on groceries in a week. The guest list read like a who's who of American power. There were politicians who'd been on the cover of Time magazine, tech billionaires who'd revolutionized entire industries, actors whose faces were known worldwide. And standing quietly near the staff entrance, in a black suit that had been dry cleaned the day before, was Samuel Carter. He wasn't supposed to be there. Drivers didn't attend family parties. But 2 days earlier, Richard Hale had personally invited him. He'd walked up to the car, after a meeting, leaned down to the driver's window, and said, "Samuel, you've been with me a long time. I'd like you to come to my birthday party. Bring your appetite. It's going to be quite a night." Samuel had smiled and said, "Thank you, sir. I'd be honored." And he was. Just not in the way Richard Hale thought. The party started at 7. By 8, the speeches had begun. Richard's daughter spoke about how her father had taught her the value of hard work. His business partner talked about his vision and integrity. And then Richard himself stood up, glass in hand, and thanked everyone for coming. He talked about gratitude, about legacy, about the people who'd helped him build everything he had. And then, looking directly at the staff gathered near the edges of the room, he said something that would be replayed on news channels for weeks. He said, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge the people who make my life possible. The people who wake up early, who work late, who do the jobs nobody sees, but everyone depends on. People like Samuel, my driver, who has been with me for 7 years and has never once let me down. Samuel, where are you? Come here." Samuel walked forward. The crowd parted. People smiled. Someone started clapping. And when Samuel reached Richard Hale, standing there with his glass raised and his arm open for a handshake, Samuel didn't take his hand. He didn't smile. He looked Richard Hale in the eyes. And for the first time in 7 years, he let Richard see exactly who he was. And then he slapped him. The sound was like a gunshot. Richard's head snapped to the side. His glass fell and shattered on the marble floor. Someone screamed. Security moved, but not fast enough, because in that moment, everything stopped. Richard Hale touched his face. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. And then he looked at Samuel, really looked at him, and his expression changed. The confusion disappeared. The shock faded. And what replaced it was something nobody in that room expected: recognition. Richard Hale stared at Samuel Carter, and in a voice so quiet that only the people closest could hear, he said, "I knew you'd come." And then he collapsed. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed. Someone called 911. Security grabbed Samuel, who didn't resist, didn't fight, didn't say a word. He just stood there, hands at his sides, staring at Richard Hale, being lifted onto a stretcher. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Richard was alive, conscious, but in shock. He was rushed to the hospital with his family following behind. And Samuel was arrested. The story hit the news within an hour. By midnight, it was trending on every social media platform. By morning, it was the lead story on every major news network. Billionaire attacked at birthday party. Driver arrested after assault. America's most generous CEO hospitalized after violent incident. The headlines were everywhere. And so were the questions. Why did he do it? What was Richard Hale talking about when he said, "I knew you'd come"? Why didn't Samuel try to run? People were fascinated, horrified, confused, and so were the police. Because when they brought Samuel in for questioning, he didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't deny what he'd done. He sat down, folded his hands on the table, and said, "I need you to look at a case from 30 years ago. A hit and run." The victim's name was Claire Carter. The detective stared at him. "What does that have to do with this?" Samuel looked him in the eyes and said, "Everything. It has to do with everything." The case file was old, dusty, buried in a storage room in a precinct that had been renovated twice since Claire's death. But it was all there: the police report, the witness statements, the photos of the scene. Claire Carter, 28 years old, found on the side of Route 42 at 11:30 p.m. on October 14th. Cause of death: blunt force trauma. No suspects, no arrests. Case closed after 6 weeks. The detective assigned to Samuel's case read through it twice, then called his captain. "There's something here, something that doesn't add up, because here's what they found." On the night Claire died, there were 2 witnesses who reported seeing a black luxury sedan speeding away from the scene. Both witnesses described the car as expensive, new, possibly a Mercedes or a BMW. Both said they'd tried to get the license plate but couldn't see it in the rain. And both witnesses had given statements to the police that were in the file. But there was something else in the file. A note, handwritten, tucked between 2 pages. It said witnesses recanted. No longer credible. Case suspended. The detective frowned. Why would both witnesses suddenly recant? He tracked them down. The first one had moved out of state. The second one, a man named George, was still living in the same town. When the detective showed up at his door, George went pale. I don't want to talk about that. It was a long time ago. The detective pressed. What happened? Why did you recant your statement? George looked away. I was told to. Who told you? George hesitated. Then he said a man came to my house 2 weeks after the accident. He said if I kept talking, I'd lose my job. My family would lose everything. He gave me $10,000 in cash and told me to forget what I saw. Did you see who was driving the car that night? The detective asked. George nodded slowly. Yeah, I saw him. It was Richard Hale. The detective's hands shook as he wrote down George's statement. He went back to the precinct and started pulling everything he could find about Richard Hale from 30 years ago. And here's what he discovered. In October, 30 years ago, Richard Hale was 35 years old. He was already successful, but not yet a billionaire. He was building his company, working 80-hour weeks, and attending events to network with investors and politicians. On the night Claire died, Richard Hale had been at a fundraiser dinner 20 miles from Route 42. According to his alibi, he left the dinner at 10:30 p.m. and drove home. His assistant confirmed it. His lawyer confirmed it. And the police at the time had no reason to doubt it. But here's what the detective found in Richard's financial records from that time. 2 weeks after Claire's death, Richard Hale made a payment of $50,000 to a law firm that specialized in crisis management. 3 weeks later, he made another payment of $20,000 to an investigator who'd worked on the case. And 6 months later, he made a payment of $200,000 to an offshore account that couldn't be traced. It was a cover-up, a deliberate, calculated cover-up, and it worked because Richard Hale went on to build his empire. He became a billionaire, a philanthropist, a man everyone admired, and Claire Carter became a name in a forgotten file. But Samuel never forgot. Samuel spent 30 years searching for the truth. He worked odd jobs, saved money, and quietly dug through public records, old newspapers, and anything he could find. And 5 years ago, he found George. George told him everything. The black sedan, the man who'd paid him off, and most importantly, the face he saw behind the wheel that night. It was Richard Hale. So, Samuel made a plan. He applied for a job as Richard's driver. He waited. He watched. He learned Richard's routines, his habits, his vulnerabilities. And he waited for the right moment. The birthday party was that moment, because Samuel knew that in front of all those people, in front of cameras and witnesses, Richard couldn't hide. He couldn't pay someone off or make a call to a lawyer. He'd have to face what he'd done. And he did. When Richard Hale said, "I knew you'd come," he wasn't confused. He was confessing. Because deep down, Richard Hale had been waiting for this day too. The media exploded. Richard Hale was charged with vehicular manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. His legal team was the best money could buy, but the evidence was overwhelming. George testified. The financial records were subpoenaed. And Samuel Carter, the man who'd been dismissed as a violent employee, became the face of a story about power, corruption, and the kind of patience most people can't even imagine. But here's where the story takes another turn. Because 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, Richard Hale died. He had a heart attack in his cell. Some people said it was the stress. Others whispered about suicide. But the truth, according to the coroner's report, was that Richard Hale's heart had simply given out. He was 65 years old, and the weight of 30 years of guilt had finally caught up with him. Samuel Carter was released. The charges against him for assault were dropped in light of the circumstances, and when reporters crowded around him outside the courthouse, asking how he felt, what he wanted to say, Samuel looked directly into the cameras and said Claire deserved better. She deserved justice, and I'm sorry it took this long. Then he walked away. People wanted a villain. They wanted a hero. But Samuel was neither. He was just a man who loved his wife and spent 3 decades making sure the person who killed her couldn't hide anymore. And that's the part of this story that should haunt you. Because how many people have the patience to wait 30 years? How many people would smile every day, drive the man who destroyed their life to meetings and dinners and parties, and never let the mask slip? And here's the real question. Was what Samuel did justice? Or was it revenge? Because those two things aren't always the same. Justice is supposed to be blind, impartial, carried out by the system. But when the system fails, when the powerful can buy their way out of consequences, what's left? Is it justice if you have to take it into your own hands? Or does that make you just as guilty as the person you're trying to punish? I want you to think about that, because if you were Samuel, if someone you loved was taken from you, and you knew who did it, and you knew they'd never face consequences unless you made them, what would you do? Would you wait? Would you plan? Or would you walk away and try to move on? After Richard Hale's death, the media circus continued for months. Documentaries were made. Podcasts dissected every detail. Richard's family released a statement saying they were devastated and hadn't known about his past. His company's stock plummeted. Several board members resigned. Charities that bore his name quietly changed their branding. And Samuel Carter disappeared. He didn't do interviews. He didn't write a book. He didn't try to profit from the story. He just vanished. Some people claimed they saw him in a small town in Montana. Others said he'd moved to Europe. But nobody knows for sure. And maybe that's how it should be. Because this story was never about fame or recognition. It was about a man who lost everything and spent 30 years making sure the person responsible couldn't pretend it never happened. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. During the investigation, detectives found something else. Something that didn't make it into most of the news reports because it was too complicated, too messy, too unresolved. They found evidence that Richard Hale might not have been alone in the car that night. There were notes in his personal files, locked in a safe in his home office. Notes that referenced another person. Someone who'd been with him at the fundraiser dinner. Someone who'd been in the passenger seat when he hit Claire. And that person was never identified. Which means, somewhere out there, someone else knows the truth. Someone else has been living with the secret for 30 years, and they're still walking around free. So, was justice really served? Or did Samuel's revenge only scratch the surface of something much bigger? Here's the thing about stories like this. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in, about power and privilege, and the way some people can commit horrible acts and simply move on with their lives, while the people they hurt are left to pick up the pieces. Claire Carter was 28 years old when she died. She was a waitress. She didn't have money or connections or a powerful family to demand answers. She was just a person trying to get home from work. And when she was killed, the system that was supposed to protect her, the system that was supposed to find justice for her, failed. Not because the police didn't care, not because there wasn't evidence, but because someone with enough money and influence decided that his future was more important than her life. And that's the real crime here. Not the slap, not even the hit and run, as horrific as that was. The real crime is that it took 30 years for the truth to come out. 30 years of Richard Hale living in mansions and giving speeches and being celebrated as a good man. 30 years of Samuel Carter living in silence, carrying a grief so heavy that most people would have been crushed by it. And the only reason the truth came out at all is because one man refused to let it stay buried. So I want you to ask yourself this. How many other Richard Hales are out there? How many people in positions of power have secrets they've paid to keep hidden? How many families are still waiting for answers, still hoping that someday, somehow, the truth will surface? And how many Samuel Carters are out there, quietly waiting, planning, holding on to the one thing that keeps them going? The belief that eventually the truth will matter. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Samuel's position, what would you have done? Would you have waited 30 years for the perfect moment to expose the truth? Or would you have gone to the police immediately, even knowing they might not believe you? Would you have confronted Richard Hale privately? Or would you have needed the whole world to see? And here's the harder question. Do you think what Samuel did was justice? Or do you think it was revenge dressed up as justice? Because those are two very different things. Justice is supposed to heal. It's supposed to restore balance. But revenge, even when it's justified, even when the person deserves it, often leaves everyone involved damaged in ways that never fully heal. So think about it. Really think about it. And then tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I'm reading every single one. I want to know how this story made you feel. I want to know if it changed the way you think about justice, about patience, about the lengths people will go to or when the system fails them. And if you're still here, if you've watched this entire story from beginning to end, comment, "I'm still here," so I know you made it. Because stories like this aren't easy to sit through. They're uncomfortable. They're messy. But they're real, and they matter. Power doesn't erase guilt. It only hides it. And no matter how much money you have, no matter how many people admire you, no matter how carefully you've buried the past, the truth has a way of finding the surface. Sometimes it takes 30 years. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. But it always comes out. Richard Hale spent 3 decades building an empire on a lie. And in the end, that lie destroyed everything. His reputation, his legacy, his family's future. All because he made one terrible decision on a rainy night in October and chose to cover it up instead of facing the consequences. And Samuel Carter spent 3 decades carrying a grief that most people can't imagine. He lost his wife. He lost his future. But he never lost his determination to make sure the person responsible couldn't pretend it never happened. So who won? Nobody. Because this story doesn't have a happy ending. Claire is still dead. Richard is dead. And Samuel is somewhere out there, alone, carrying a different kind of weight now. The weight of knowing that he got his justice. But it didn't bring her back. It never does. So the next time you see someone in power, someone everyone admires, someone who seems untouchable, remember this story. Because you never know what's buried underneath the surface. You never know what secrets are being kept, what lies are being maintained, what truths are waiting for someone brave enough or broken enough to bring them into the light. And if this story made you think, if it made you feel something, do me a favor. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And hit that subscribe button. Let's prove my mom wrong today. And don't forget that we tell stories like this every week. Stories about real people, real choices, and the moments that change everything. Thank you for watching. And remember, the truth always finds a way. Always.